Probably my best video yet. How to copy your favorite pair of pants into a pattern, or any pair of pants, without having to take them apart. Because why should you have to ruin a perfectly good pair of pants to make a good pair of pants? And you can take your favorite pair of pants and add details and change the fit to make them your even more favorite pair of pants. You're gonna learn a fair amount of pattern making knowledge in this video, but also kind of one of the beautiful things about knocking off a piece of clothing is if you do it correctly, you can pretty much skip the fitting process because you already know what you're copying fits well. So these are the pants I copied in this video, and these are the pants I made with the pattern. I changed the fit a little bit to make them wider and the pockets a little bit to make them swaggier. But without further ado, let's get started. First things first, get a pair of pants that fit you well. And I'm definitely more concerned about it fitting well in the waist and the hip and butt, because as long as it fits well in this area, changing the fit and the silhouette of the legs is very simple. We're gonna be using the tried and true Today's formula, which stands for trace, true, and then add seam allowance. And when we true the pattern, we'll add the pleats and or darts if you have any. And I'm going to show two different ways to trace. For the first method, you will need something to mark the seam line, so either chalk or tape, then some trace paper and a pencil. Then for the second method of tracing, we're going to use a pattern tracing wheel and just normal paper. So take your pants off and bring them to the ironing board. And the first panel we're going to copy is the front panel. We're going to lay them nice and flat, making sure we can see the seam line of the entire front panel. And then we'll press this as flat as we possibly can. And we're going to be copying the side of the front panel where the fly piece is on top. So that's the left leg for men and the right leg for women. And if your front panel has a pleat or pleats, just press those nice and flat. And we're going to add those back in when we true the pattern. So I'm just using plenty of steam and kind of putting the other leg out of the way. And once everything's laying nice and flat, we can put it on a flat surface. And you just want to make sure that you can see the seam line. So where the fabric meets on the front panel all the way around. Now laying it out nice and flat on a flat surface. And we're going to be marking the entire seam line of just the front panel. And that is where the fabric meets. So not the top stitching, but this very edge of where the front panel connects to the back panel. And all the way around on that seam line. So you can do this with chalk or with tape. And the reason we're marking it is so when we put the trace paper over, we can clearly see that seam line. So I did a little bit with chalk here just to give you an idea. And then with the tape, the same idea. I'm just putting the edge of the tape to the edge of the seam line. And if you're going to use tape, make sure on the curved edges to use multiple pieces so you can properly shape that curve. And it's also important to use a contrasting tape from your fabric, because when we put the trace paper over, then we'll be able to see it very clearly. Boom. So the entire seam line of your front panel should be marked, and no need to mark the hem because it'll be easy to see the end of the pants on your trace paper. And as you can see now, you can clearly see that seam line whether you use tape or chalk. The only downside with chalk is depending on your chalk, you might have to wash the pants after you clone them. And we're going to leave out the pocket and just focus on the entire shape of the front panel. Now make sure everything is still laying nice and flat, and grab your trace paper. We're going to lay it across the entire front panel. You want to make sure to have enough trace paper around the panel to add seam allowance on all the sides, and then also hem allowance at the bottom. So my hem allowance is about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to want to include at least double that of paper below my hem. Now grab some pins, and we're going to pin the paper directly to the fabric. I'm just going to start at the bottom here. Make sure everything's laying nice and flat, and then just pin right through the paper. Make sure I'm getting the fabric as well. So I've put one at the middle of the bottom. I'm just going to take my hands, kind of flatten things out towards the knee, place another one in the middle through the fabric and the paper. And I usually like to just put pins along the center of the piece, just so the paper doesn't shift around, but I can still lift up and make sure everything's looking right as I trace. Then I'll place another pin towards the crotch line right in the center. Then I'm going to put one towards the top. And I don't know if I got a great visual of the top section here, the waistline, but I'm marking just before the waistband. Place that final pin towards the top, and you can kind of lift up slightly if you need to get that pin through. Now you are ready to trace. And using this tape or chalk method, that seam line is super easy to spot all the way around. Just take it slow, and if you need to lift up the paper to make sure everything's looking good, just following along with your pencil, either on the very edge of your tape or just right along your chalk line. Doesn't really matter where you start, but I do like to start at roughly the crotch point and get the most important areas first, and just taking it slow, making sure everything's laying nice and flat. All right, here's how mine is looking. Trace nicely, just right along that seam line.
Now we can remove the pins and our piece of paper and set it aside. Before I set it aside, I'm just gonna mark this piece as my front panel. I'm gonna remove my tape for video purposes, but we did technically mark some of the seam lines for the back panel. So if you wanna keep them on, that's up to you. I just want this video to be as clear as possible. So I'm just gonna mark it again for you guys. All right, now we're going to mark the seam line of one of the back panels. Doesn't really matter which side, but I'm gonna do the panel that's on top on the back rise. And we're just marking the seam line, so where the fabric meets. So how I'm gonna position my pants is by prioritizing the side that goes to the middle, so the back rise and the back of the inseam, because most, if not all, pants have a bigger back panel, so it is going to wrap around to the front when laying flat. So we are going to iron all of this flat, but I'm going to prioritize the back inseam and the back rise, so the out seam will be folded over. So I have the whole inner back seam line exposed and the out seam will be folded over. And another kind of key point for this step is when we iron, we want this folded side to be as straight as we possibly can have it. So if that means pulling this side a little bit more under, exposing more of this seam line, then that is totally fine. We are going to get the out seam. We're just going to fold over the paper with the fold of the pants. So we want it to be as straight as possible. Now bring this to your ironing board and we're going to start by pressing the back inner seam line nice and flat and visible. So I have a fair amount of my front inseam peeking over, but that's totally fine because I am kind of prioritizing this inner side of the back panel. So I'm just going along with plenty of steam and maneuvering my pants however I need to get everything on the back panel laying as flat as possible. So I have the back inner part laying nice and flat. And now this fold that is close to the out seam is already pretty straight, but I am going to go through as I press and see if I can straighten out a little bit more. And if that means pulling a little bit more of the under fabric this way, then that is totally fine. Boom. So once your back panel is laying nice and flat with the inner back seam line nicely exposed, and then this fold on the side seam as straight as possible, bring them over to a flat surface and we're going to start marking. Also forgot to mention, if you have a dart in the back, just lay that as flat as you possibly can. And we're going to add that when we true the pattern. And if you have a yoke on your pants, I would recommend doing that separately from the main back panel. So I do the majority of the back panel first, but then go and repress the yoke and get the true shape of the yoke. All right, now I'm going to mark the center back seam line and then we'll flip to the other side and get the rest of the back panel, which is the out seam. And just marking right on the seam line where the fabric meets. Once the inner part and the majority of your waistband of your back panel is marked, just gonna grab the fold on the side and I'll continue by marking the rest of the waist to the seam line of the side seam and then all the way down the side seam. Boom, so your entire back panel should now be marked, laying nice and flat, and then the other leg should just be out of the way. Now grab your trace paper. We're gonna cover the entire back panel. And you're going to want to have enough room around the edge of your back panel to add seam allowance, hem allowance, and you also want to have plenty of paper peeking beyond this fold to also get the rest of the back panel that is folded under. So I'm going to leave enough room for seam allowance all the way around and then hem allowance at the bottom. And then as much excess as I can, I will get towards this fold. Grab some pins. So we're going to do a very similar thing. Going to place a pin at the middle of the bottom, at the middle towards the knee, middle towards the crotch, and a middle towards the top. And we're pinning right through the paper into the fabric, making sure everything's laying nice and flat. And once your paper is pinned in place, we can begin tracing the inner back seam line and the majority of the waist of the back panel. So just going along, tracing the edge of your tape or right on your chalk lines, making sure your paper and fabric are laying nice and flat, and you can always lift up if you need to. Once the majority of your back panel is traced, we're going to now flip this entire piece over and get the rest of this side. I'm just gonna flip the entire piece on its face, trying to make sure everything's still laying nice and flat. And now I'm just going to fold this excess paper over onto the rest of the back panel. And I really want to hug the fold in the pants. So folding it right with the fold of the pants, not bunching the pants, just right on that fold. Grab some pins and I'm going to start at the bottom. So folding the paper right with the fold of the fabric, just hugging that fold. Place a pin towards the bottom. I'm just going to kind of put it in the middle just to hold our paper in place. Then I'm going to come towards the knee, folding the paper with the fold of the pants. Place another pin. Then towards the crotch, just folding that paper with the fold of the pants. And we wanted to get that fold of the pants as straight as possible. But if there is a little bit of curvature, we'll try just follow that with our paper and just make sure that we're folding the paper with the fold of the pants. Placing a pin towards the crotch, and then finally towards the top, folding that paper really with the fold of the pants. And if there is any curvature, it's probably closer to the top. So if you need to kind of maneuver that paper with the curvature, make sure to do so. Mine has a tiny bit of curvature from the hip to the waist, so I'm gonna place a few extra pins just to really try and get that shape. Boom. So now your paper should be folded with that fold of the pants, and now we can finish tracing the rest of the back panel. As you go, just make sure it's laying nice and flat with the fold, and the fold of the paper is matching the fold of the pants. Just guiding along with my hand as I go, nice and slow right along that seam line. And if you need to reposition your paper, do not be shy. It can be hard to get this first try. Once the rest of your back panel is traced, we can remove our pins, flip our entire piece back over, remove your other pins, and you should be left with a full back panel. I'm gonna label this back. I'm gonna put my back panel aside and show you the other method for tracing now before we move on to the smaller components and the truing and the darts. We're gonna position our front panel the same exact way as the first version. One leg out of the way, and we're gonna press everything nice and flat with all of the seam lines of the front panel visible. Should look something like this. Now we're going to lay this on a flat surface, but this time we are going to lay it on top of normal paper, and you want your paper to be large enough to get the entire panel and then also account for seam allowance and hem allowance. Once laying nice and flat with enough room for seam allowance and hem allowance, grab a few pins and we're going to pin the pants to the paper. Make sure to get it through the pants and the paper, and we're doing this so the pants don't shift around. I put one towards the bottom, one towards the knee, and I'll put one towards the crotch line and one towards the top. And really make sure to get it through the fabric and the paper as well. Once your pants are pinned to the paper and everything is laying nice and flat, grab your tracing wheel, and we are just going to trace around the seam line, and this tool will puncture right through the fabric and give us a dotted line on the paper. So just following the seam line of the front panel where the fabric meets, and we're just going to go slow and carefully puncture through the fabric into the paper with enough pressure all the way around. And towards the crotch point here, I might just add one more pin to make sure it stays nicely in place. Just going right along that seam line. On the thicker parts, putting enough pressure to really puncture through all the fabric and get it into the paper. And you can always lift up a little bit, make sure that your dotted lines are there. Through some of the thicker parts, you might just not be able to make it all the way through, but we'll just get as much of the seam line as we can and then redraw those parts with a little bit of pencil. The bottom of the hem. And as I go, I'm just trying to make sure the fabric doesn't shift, so putting pressure with my hands, or you could always put more pins. Once you've used your tracing wheel around the entire seam line of the front panel, you can pull out your pins, and you should be left with a dotted line of the seam line. And there might be some small gaps where there was bulk, but it is pretty easy to see what the shape would have been. So we're just gonna go through and connect all of the dotted lines with pencil, and if there's little gaps, we'll just fill those in. So grab your pencil and a ruler. You could also just freehand this a little bit, which I might do, but just follow along your dotted line, making the pattern a little bit more clear. If your pants are a thinner material, you might just have a perfect dotted line all the way around, and you could skip doing the pencil, but I'm going to add it for visual purposes. All right, so I've connected my lines with a little bit of freehand and my ruler. I'm gonna mark this front and then set this aside, or in my case, I'm just gonna push it over because I have enough space for my back panel. Now we're gonna iron our back panel nice and flat, and just like the first method, we're going to prioritize the inner back seam line. So just using plenty of steam, making sure I can see the inner back seam line, and then the side seam will be folded over for now. Now lay it nice and flat on your paper with enough room to add seam allowance, hem allowance, and also enough room on this side that is folded over to accommodate for the rest of the back panel. I'm going to pin it into place onto the paper, starting at the bottom towards the knee, the crotch, the top. And this time I'm gonna put a few more various pins in place just so I don't have to put as much pressure with my hand. So I put plenty of pins in place just to make sure my pants don't move around as I trace. Now I'm going to trace the seam line of all of the back panel we can see. So that'll be the majority of the waist, the back rise, the back of the inseam, and then most of the hem. Just using my tracing wheel with plenty of pressure going right through the fabric. You want to be careful of your fly if it's laying under, but this is a fairly straight line. So as long as you get a good portion of it, we'll be able to just draw that straight line in. Going right up to the fold, and then stopping. And we're not going to trace this folded edge yet. Once you have traced most of the seam line, you're going to want to grab a measuring tape or a ruler. We're going to start at the top here and measure the distance from this folded edge to the out seam along the seam line of the waist. So mine is 2 inches exactly. I'm just going to follow the angle of the waistline seam line and mark that distance. So mine was 2 inches, just following that exact angle, mark a point. And then I'll do the same thing at the hem. So measure the distance from this folded edge to the out seam. Looks like I'm about 1.25 inches here. And then we'll follow the angle of the hem and mark that distance we measured. So 1.25 inches for me, put a point. And now we're gonna remove all of our pins and our pants from the paper. The majority of the panel is on our paper. You can see I have a few gaps, but the general shape is there. Now bring your pants back to the ironing board. We're looking at the same panel we just traced the majority of, but now we're gonna roll over the side, exposing the entire out seam line. Now we're going to press this fold flat with the out seam fully exposed, not worrying about the inner back seam line because we already traced that. Once you can see your entire out seam and it's laying nice and flat, we'll bring it back to our paper. Now back at our paper, and we're gonna line up right where the out seam meets the top of the waistline, right to that initial point we made. So this corner right here, can place a pin right through it and then stab that right into the point on the paper. And you can even push that through. Then pretty much the same thing at the bottom, but this corner right here, so the bottom of the hem at the bottom of the out seam, we're gonna line that up to the other point we made. No need to place a pin through this. You can just slide that right on top of the point. Now with the pants positioned like this, I'm gonna make sure these bottom points are aligned and then start pinning my pants to the paper again. So make sure everything's laying nice and flat, and I'm just going to pin the pants to the paper. Kind of more emphasizing this area because we already traced the back inner seam line. So I've placed plenty of pins holding my pants in place, and really the only line we're tracing is this out seam line. So now that I know my pants are positioned right, I am actually going to remove this one in the corner because we're gonna trace through that. Just grabbing my tracing wheel, starting at the bottom and following the seam line all the way up the out seam. I'm gonna get to the top here. I might do just this little corner of the waist as well. Boom. Once you trace your out seam with your tracing wheel, you can remove your pants and connect your dotted lines with a pencil. And you should have enough dotted line to get the entire outline. But let's say you missed a significant portion. You can always just reference your pants for your best educated guess. Oh, I'm going to label this back. Now I'm going to show you how to add pleats and darts to your pants if you have them, and then we'll true. We're going to start off with a dart on the back panel. So grab your pants and your back panel, grab something to measure, and looking at your pants, we're going to measure from one end, so either the center back or the side seam, to the seam line of the dart. So for my center back seam, it is 5 3/4 inches. You can also measure from the side seam. We just want the distance from one of the sides to the seam line of the dart. So now I know that the seam line of my dart is 5 3/4 inches from the center back. I'm going to measure the length of my dart. So from the seam line of the waistband to the tip of my dart, and mine is 4.5 inches. I'm going to mark these measurements on my paper pattern piece. So the distance from one of the sides to the seam line of the dart and the length from the base of the dart to the tip. And I would say most darts are perpendicular from the waistband, which mine is, but if yours is angled, you're going to want to account for that. Now we're going to mark this on our back panel. So 5 3/4 inches from the center back seam for me. Put a little mark, and then perpendicular from the waistline is the length of the dart. Mine was 4.5 inches. So I'll draw the length of my dart in place. So now we have the seam line of our dart in place. Now we're going to measure the dart intake, so how much fabric it is actually taking away. And if we look at a little mock dart I made in paper, the width of the fold of the dart takes away double the fabric. So this is a 1/2 inch dart, but it takes away 1 inch of fabric. I'd say most pants darts are about a 1/2 inch in the back. We can just flip it to the inside and measure at the very top on the waist and measure that fold. So mine is a 1/2 inch. So my dart intake is 1 inch. inch. Now to mark my dart, I know that my entire intake is 1 inch, but I will go half an inch on either side of the dart seam line. So I'll just mark a half inch to the right of this line we made, and then a half inch to the left. Or whatever your dart intake is, you're gonna do half on either side of this line we made. Now I'm just going to connect these points to the tip of my dart, creating the dart legs. Boom, should look something like that. Now that we have our dart marked on our paper pattern piece, to accommodate for the space that's gonna be taken away from this dart, I'm going to add half of my intake, so a half inch, and then the other half of my intake to the center back, so another half inch. So that's a very simple process. We're just going to extend the waistline on both sides, half of your entire dart intake. So I'm gonna measure half inch out on the side seam, draw a line, and then the same thing on my center back. I will just line it up with the waistline and then draw another half inch mark going out. And now with these half inch extensions, we're just gonna blend those with the center back seam and the side seam. I'm just gonna grab my ruler and line it up to that mark we made and line it up as best as I can and redraw that center back line. And if I need to come in with a curve, then I will, but this is looking pretty good for the center back seam extended by a half inch. And then the same thing on the side seam. So lining it up to that half inch extension or whatever yours is, and then blending that line with the rest of the side seam. And if you have significant curvature on the top part of the side seam of your back panel, I would definitely take some sort of curve or hip curve and try and match that curve from the extension point to the rest of your side seam. So for the back dart, that's all you're gonna have to do. We have our dart marked and we accommodated for the fabric that's gonna be taken away. Let's say you have a double dart on the back of your pants. You'll just do that exact same process, starting with one dart, mark your dart, add the extension, then mark your second dart and add a further extension. Now I'm going to show you how to do a pleat or pleats if your front panel is pleated. So grab your front panel and your pants. I grabbed a different pair because mine weren't pleated. We're going to start by measuring the pleat intake. So measure the depth or the width of the fold. Mine's a half inch. And then we will double that measurement for the pleat intake. You can write that down or just keep it in mind. Mine is 1 inch total. So it is a half inch fold. Now we're going to place a crease line on our pants. So grab your front panel. And first I'm going to go 90 degrees from the side seam right to the tip of the crotch point and draw a line across. Now we're going to find the middle of this crotch line. So mine is 14 inches. So I'm going to mark 7 inches. Now from the midpoint of our crotch line, we're going to draw a perpendicular line all the way down to the hem and all the way up to the waistline. So just 90 degrees from that midpoint to the hem and then all the way up to the waistline. Now I'm going to cut literally from the top of my page. Now I'm going to cut from the top of my page, following this entire crease line all the way through the bottom. So starting at the bottom, following my crease line, all the way to and through the top of my piece. Once you cut through your entire page, I'm going to place my finger right on the hemline and then pivot the top open to my pleat intake. So mine's an inch. I'm going to grab my ruler and just make sure that the top of my front panel now has an opening equal to my pleat intake. So with my hemline still aligned and then the top of my front panel pivoted open to my pleat intake, I'm going to grab some tape, put a little bit of tape at the hemline, and then I'll slide my ruler down and put a piece of tape here, carefully making sure to maintain that same opening. Now I'm going to lift up the top portion and slide in a piece of paper all the way down to the bottom and just make sure to maintain that same opening at the top. And double check with our ruler. You could just add a piece of paper at the top, but I like to have a very secure pattern piece. So I'm just gonna go along and tape along the opening to make sure everything's secure. So I went ahead and taped it all up. And this method for slashing the crease line and spreading at the top is pretty standard for adding a pleat to a normal pants block pattern. But let's say you wanted to just have a wider leg throughout and have your pleat, you could just open up at the top here, the same amount throughout, so all the way down, and that would just add more bagginess to your whole leg. Now if I fold the pleat with my paper, you can see we maintain the same shape of the front panel, just added the pleat. Boom. So now you should have a solid block pattern for whatever pants you copied. We're still going to true and then add seam allowance. And really the only other pieces I would trace would be the back pockets, the front pockets. So using the exact same method of either taping or chalking, laying your paper over and tracing, or putting your paper under and using your trace wheel. And my front pockets are just patch pockets. So it's incredibly simple and I'm going to do the same exact method. And as far as the waistband, I really wouldn't trace this part. I would just take double the depth plus your waist circumference and
and then a few inches of extra space before adding seam allowance. And the way I pattern pants pockets and jeans pockets is so simple and so easy. So my very next video is going to be how to pattern and sew jeans or pants pockets. Add this onto this video. It's going to be way too long. And I've already put out videos on the pattern of waistbands and belt loops, as well as the construction process of an entire pair of pants. I do it a little bit differently nowadays. My construction is a little bit cleaner. I'd be happy to do another full tutorial on a stupid clean pants construction. But for now, we're gonna move on to truing the pattern and then adding seam allowance. So grab both your front and back panels. And before I show off the little page I drew, this would be the time to make any fit adjustments if you want to. I'm gonna make my legs a little bit wider. My outseams are pretty square, so I'll just increase the width on the inseam, the same for both panels. You could bring in the waist a little bit, you could make it bigger, really up to you. Once you made your fit adjustments, if any, we can take a peek at this little sheet I made. True pants pattern. All we're really gonna do is just make sure that the front and the back line up properly. So the first thing we are going to check is the inseam. So the front inseam should equal the back inseam, as you can see in black. Then we're gonna move on to the outseam. So the front outseam should equal the back outseam. And then when everything is nicely aligned, we'll square the necessary corners. So grab your measuring tape, and I'm just gonna walk it along the inseam to get the exact measurement of the front and the back. Turns out it's my lucky day and my inseams match up perfectly, but let's say they didn't. If the difference in length is about a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 centimeter or less, then I would just extend the shorter one to match. But if it's more than that, let's say it's like a 1/2 inch off, I would maybe do a combination of that, but also mess with the curve of the inseam towards the crotch point. So if one's longer, you can make the curve less deep to get it shorter, or if one's shorter, you can make the curve more deep to add length. Now, once your inseams match each other, we're gonna do the same thing to the outseam. So just measure along and make sure they line up. Seems like your boy's been practicing, because my outseam was only 1/8 of an inch off, so that was quite a simple fix. So once your inseams are the same and your outseams are the same, we can move on to squaring the necessary corners. And if I'm being real, I skipped this step for a very long time and was just fine. Once you know something, it's kind of hard to not do it. So up to you, but I'm going to square all the corners that I have marked here. So both of these points at the center back, both of these points at the center front, and then all of the hems. So I'm just gonna go through and square off the necessary points just for about a 1/2 inch or like 1.3 centimeters. So I just go in with the corner of my ruler and make sure the necessary points are nicely squared off. So once all of your necessary corners are square, you might need to go through with your curve and just smooth out the line from the square. Give yourself a pat on the back because your pattern is true. Still gotta add seam allowance though. And I also forgot to mention this on the waistband. We just wanna make sure that the waistband length, which I usually just do a straight waistband, so it's a rectangle. So the waistband length equals the front waist times 2 plus the back waist times 2, and then enough space to cover your fly shield. The amount of seam allowance you add really depends on the type of finish you're gonna give your pants. I personally am gonna do 3/4 inch for my flat felt seams and then 1/2 inch for everything else. So on my inseam of both of my panels, I will do flat felt. So I'm gonna do a 3/4 inch, and then same for my back rise, I'm gonna do a 3/4 inch seam allowance, but then everything else, I'm gonna do a 1/2 inch. So determine what seam allowances you're gonna use. And if you're having a hard time deciding, just ask chat. Then just take your ruler and line up your desired seam allowance to your seam line, and we're just gonna go along all of our pattern pieces at that seam allowance. So I just like to guide my ruler as I go. Around the curves, it can be a little bit tricky, but you get the hang of it. And I just like to put my pencil right next to where I'm lining up my seam allowance on the seam line, and this process really doesn't take that long. And same for the pleat, you're just adding seam allowance right through that extra paper we added all the way around. And for your hem allowance, it does depend on the finish of the pants that you're copying, but most pants just have a double fold hem. So just measure the hem, double it, and then we'll add that to the bottom. So I have a 3/4 inch double fold hem, so I'm gonna add 1.5 inches at the bottom, or maybe even a little bit more just in case, because it's always nicer to have the option for too long than too short. Once all of your pattern pieces have seam and hem allowance, you can cut them out on the seam allowance line and you are ready to get sewing. Here's the inside of the pants I made. So clean. No serger used. Oh yeah. And here's how they look on body. I made the legs a little bit wider change the pockets, but overall, very similar fit up in the hips and waist, and probably my new favorite pants. Make sure to leave any questions you have down below, and look out for those next videos I was talking about, and let me know what type of videos you'd like to see. I do this for you because you're making my dreams possible. Try and like and subscribe for the boy. I'll see you guys in the next one.